then so from that song,
should I scream and shout? Should I speak of love? Let my feelings out.
well, it talks about her connection with Jesus, and then she makes a comment about her own life.
Yeah.
Right? It's just a man, maybe just another man, like I've known many before, and you go, okay, you kind of have this idea about her, but yet when we look at the Bible, there's nothing about that. So where did that come from? And how is it to this day that when we talk about Mary Magdalene, we have this image of her life in the most dark way? And I'll kind of talk about how that happened. But I also want to know, what is it about her? What's so special about her? What's something about her that she pops up quite often in the New Testament, in the Gospels? So last week, I ended up the sermon with a verse. So look in John, and it's the second part of the Bible, 115, John 20, verse 18. John 20, the Gospel of John, chapter 20, verse 18. And if you want to look back, it's 115 in the back of the Bible. And of course, when the Bible was written, or the books of the Bible, or the various epistles of the Bible, they didn't have chapters and verses. That came way later. And sometimes they divided it arbitrarily, and so we get sometimes confused. But what they've done in the English translations is have nice little subtitles so you can follow along there too. So, chapter 20, verse 18, it said, Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, I have seen the Lord. And she told them that he had said these things to her. Now that's very significant. It's a simple statement. I have seen the Lord. A lot of theological reasons and issues behind that. But it's given to her to say that. So hold that, because we're going to come way back on that one there too. So what we have here in the resurrection story, right? Crucifixion, Mary and some of her disciples come forward, and they find the empty tomb. Two of the guys, Peter and another person, show up, at least in John. They look in and they just leave. And they leave Mary there. Right? She's there. And she then moves forward on that part. Time and time again, and all the scriptures, all the Gospels do declare that Mary Magdalene is the first of the followers to go to the tomb. And they all mention her as being one of the first, if not the first, person to see the risen Lord. Now, that sounds like, wow, that's a great story.
But wasn't there three Marys that way?
Yeah, yes, there's some other aspects of that too, so we'll come back to that. Very good, because that's kind of the story behind that, whole aspect of it. But this is very important because in that time, and we haven't unfortunately changed that much in the 2,000 years since then, women were not just second class, they were considered property. Right? Get that. They had no legal rights. Now, there were women who had businesses, but it was probably under the name of their husband or the male figure that was taking care of them, supposedly. So they were able to do business, but they didn't necessarily control it all. All the things that they had really belonged to the men in their lives. So, and here in this scripture, we start seeing a transformation of thinking that, again, unfortunately hasn't permeated our culture, or even at that time. Even the disciples didn't necessarily look at women who was hanging around with them as that part of it. So we have stories upon stories in the Gospel of John. It was interesting among all the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John continually brings up women into the picture of being there, of being significant in the roles they play. We talked about Jesus meeting the Samaritan woman. Remember that?
Yeah.
And again, when we say Samaritan woman, we have this idea of a woman of ill repute. All Samaritan means is where they're from, right? I asked you where you're from, right? And you told me, this is my heritage, right? This is the country I'm come from, my parents. It's the same thing. Samaritan means that she came from Samaria. So he's given us a different understanding of who these women were and Jesus' interaction with them. Which is really, really important to this. So Mary was the first person to see the risen Christ, and therefore actually raises and elevates the status of women. Okay, we haven't lived up to that, but that's it. It's there. It didn't say Peter, who was like the most zealous of everybody. It didn't talk about John. It didn't talk about anybody else. It talked about Mary being the person to do that. Now that's on one level, and we'll come back to the other level that we don't always hear about her, but she's very significant. So among the women who are specifically named in the canonical Gospels, the canonical Gospels are the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are other Gospels that I'll mention too in a little bit. These are the ones that have been kind of accepted as the bona fide books and should be in the Bible. If you're Roman Catholic background, you'll hear about the Apocrypha, and there's some books there too. She is mentioned 12 times.
Oh, really?
Really, 12 times.
Huh.
We just hear about this incident, but when you go back and you mentioned already, she's already was mentioned with the other Marys. And interesting, Mary was a very popular name at that time too. So that's why you got a lot of Mary. I've got the seasons, right? All of a sudden, your age group, you start meeting other people with your name, and so the same thing there. So everybody at that time, everybody wanted to marry. So that was happening there. So 12 times she's mentioned with other Marys. Mary of the mother of James and Joseph, and Mary the mother of, or the Mary of Bethany. There's another Bethany, the one that was
Mary and Martha.
the sister of Lazarus, right? Who was resuscitated from death. There's even another Mary called Mary Clopas. It's not and that's the husband's name. So you get that experience there too. So you have this group of women who always were there, and in fact, when the guys ditched the scene, then Mary hung in there, right? And we have mentioned even at the crucifixion, and I don't know if it was the movie with Gibson, The Passion of Christ, but it was the women who hung in there to the end at that point, and apparently again to the beginning of a new era for us in humanity. So it isn't just insignificant that he mentions this. Again, he wants to elevate, understand that the creation story, the redemption of humanity, was including the ones that are most marginalized. You hear that? The most marginalized. So that's why we see a lot of engagement of Jesus with people who have different challenges in their lives. Could be physical, right? They're blind, they couldn't walk, they're dead. But it could also be in terms of status. Right? Give me something to drink. And so the Samaritan woman goes, "You're asking me? You're a Jew. Look who I am. You're not supposed to do that, right?" We have different wells, right? The Jews drink over here and the Samaritans drink over here. We've been through that story, right?
Oh, yeah.
And that history. And that's the way it was feeling. And he says, "No, I'm asking you because I have something to give you." She goes, "What is that?" And so she runs off and tells all her friends, "Look who I met. He's talking to me. He knows about me. And he sees me." That's an important word in the New Testament. To see is to acknowledge and value the other person. In fact, there are some greetings in some African tribes, when they see each other, they don't say hi, they say, I see you. I know that you exist, you're important. That's important, right?
Yeah.
We all want to, do you hear me? Do you see, you know? And this is what the biblical writers are getting at, and definitely underscored by John. She sees the Lord, and that Lord speaks to her. And the fact that when she's mentioned with the other people, other Marys, she tends to be the first one listed. Now, I thought that was very interesting. Why is she listed among all the others? So that's the first one. Well, when you go back and ever read the Bible, the New Testament, and then we start naming the disciples, Peter keeps going up to the front.
Right.
He was significant. So John is saying she is significant. Certainly she was seen as second class, but even among that group of people, she was number one. Very, very important. Now, she doesn't appear in the other scriptures, only in the New Testament. Maybe in Acts, when all the Christians were kind of gathered together in Agora. At that time they weren't called Christians. They were still Jews.
Right.
Who were following this risen Lord, right? And so they were pretty frightened. They were already being kind of ostracized. They were seen as kind of radicals. And they were already being pressured and persecuted at that time, even that really after. But they huddled together in Acts 1, when people came together and began to share of what they had, because they had only, we talk about the shared economy now. It's going on forever. Like, we're all together on this thing. You in, I'm bringing my goods, and we're going to, keep ourselves going. And so the assumption is she was there too, right? Not necessarily mentioned, but she was there too. But who is this Mary? The Gospel of John keeps lifting up, who puts her at the front of all the other women groups, and at the very beginning of this new era of our times. Who was she? Well, we don't have much to go on. We can surmise that she was from a town of Magdala. There is a small town on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. And that's what it is, right? That's where she's from, right? It tells us that that was where she grew up. She was Galilean. So she was part of that community. In fact, people from Galilee had an accent. I don't know what that was like. Oh, you're from the South, right? You're from New York, right? And so that's why when Jesus was in Jerusalem and with his, I call them his knuckleheads, his disciples, they all say, "You're from Galilee." We could tell them, "No, I'm not." Change like, "What do you mean I'm from Galilee? I'm not." But she was from there, from that community there. And so a strong identification with who Jesus was, like, she's one of my people. And she was not only the witness to the resurrection, but she was also the witness to his death. Going back to the Passion of Christ, when everybody abandoned him, when their dreams were shattered, when they saw him as a political figure, and I think maybe this is the sensibility of women, is to connect to something more about him than what the guys were thinking. Sure, she was also hoping for Messiah to liberate them from the occupation of the Roman Empire and all that, but she hung in there. So she was there when he died, and she was there when they took his body and entombed him. So very, very important. So she was a key witness to the events of his death and what happened there, and obviously the resurrection. In what we do know about her background is in Luke 8. And you can turn with me to Luke 8, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, page 67, in the back of the book, 1 through 3. Luke 8, chapter 8, verses 1 through 3. And it reads this way. Follow along with me. Soon afterwards, he went on through the cities and villages, proclaiming and bringing the good news of the kingdom of God. Okay? The 12 were with him, right? Those are his 12. His posse was with him, right? As well as some women who had been cured of evil spirits and infirmities. I'll come back to that. Mary called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out. And Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward, wow, I didn't know that was that close to the palace. And of course, Susanna and then many others who provided for them out of their resources. Now, I read that many times and I just caught that. Wow. So it wasn't just the people, the rank and file who were responding to it, was people with status again. And we have that off and on going on. And so here we have a few things going on. One, this group of people, the world today would say, well, these were what do they call the people that follow the rock stars, the groupies, right? Yeah, it could have been that too. But it said they have been cured. So these women, these individuals, whatever they were, and that could have been a cultural thing, well, the women are, they're just so uppity or they're so emotional, what have you. But it talks specifically about her. She had 7 demons. And we talk about that kind of aspect in our lives. We have these demons in us that kind of control us. Our addiction, things that are dark in our lives, that kind of hamper what we want to be, what we want to become. And somehow in the relationship with Jesus, that all changed. And when you are liberated by that, you want to hang on to that. What is that juice? I want some of that juice. I want to keep drinking that. I want to hang around with people that has looked at me as a human being and not me as a troubled individual. Right? That's a natural response. And this person said, I'm going to hang with this guy because he saw me and he saw what I needed to happen, what needs to happen in my life, and it occurred, and I'm free from those things. I'm in. And later on, you'll read some more scriptures where these group of women, again, they were second class. Whatever they owned was in the name of their husband or the male figure of that community or family. But whatever they had, they supported the efforts. People say, so how did Jesus live, Remember that time of the feeding of the 5,000? And they said, hey, we don't have any money to feed them. Send them home. They didn't have anybody to give them that information or the money. So you have this aspect of people giving what they had to other people. And in fact, it really points out it was the women who supported Jesus in his endeavors. Interesting, huh? Yeah. It wasn't the guys that were out there hustling for the money. It was the women who were. Because here's the word in Mark. It goes on. One of the words that is talked about how they served him in verse 3. I think it says there, who provided for them. And sometimes that word is him. It all depends which translation, which was for Jesus. Yeah, we'll take care of the guys, but it's really about him, right? It's about him. Out of their resources. Wow. That's humbling. Again, going who they are, what they had, but what they gave freely to them. And the word that's used here is dikaionoio. Dikaionoio, which from the word means serve, which we get the word deacon. Right? We serve people, right? So they were serving and taking care of him and the other guys, because most of them were fishermen. They didn't know anything else about it. They could fish, but they didn't know how to maybe have any other kind of business going on. So that's an important aspect of it. It implied that it was ministry. They did it freely. They did it graciously. They did it out of thankfulness, this generosity to maintain the person who transformed their lives. And then in Mark, you go back a little further, or go forward. Mark, we have Mark chapter 15, and that's 15, verses 40 to 41, and
What page?
52. Oh, I'm sorry, 53, 53, 54. Yeah, verses 40, 41. And then, read down towards the bottom, it says, Then there were also women looking from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of James and the younger, and of Joseph or Joseph, and Solomon. These used to follow him and provide for him when he was in Galilee, right? And there were many other women that come up with him to Jerusalem. Now, it comes up because Jerusalem is upward to a hill, right? Wow. You all follow me what's going on here? You know, Jesus' ministry could not be a Bible ministry if it wasn't for the women who were supporting him in his efforts, and his disciples as well. Now, Judas was the one who was handling the money, but it was the women who was really earning it and getting the resources that were needed. And they followed him, right? It says had come up with him. The word follow in Greek is the same one that is used for disciples. The followers of Jesus, we use that word, right? The disciples of Jesus, the same thing. Followers and disciples are the same. So, this is saying, now hear me, that Mary was a disciple. And many other women were disciples. They weren't just hanging around. They weren't just groupies. They were really learning and understanding what it means to be a follower of God. And I'll come back to where our status in a little moment, but I just want to get you that understanding. Now, the cultural biases here, we call it implicit bias. You know, the guys couldn't cut him out to say, we can't elevate her to the other 12. So there weren't just 12 disciples. You heard it here. There weren't just 12 disciples. There were many others. And a lot of them were women. So let's go on. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, it wasn't always recognized. We're going to go to the epistles of Paul. We're going to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Chapter 15. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 and 8. 176, thank you. 3 and 8. All right. 15, 3 and 8. All right, let's read this. For I handed on to you as of the first importance, I in turn had received that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. So he's writing to the Corinthians. Corinthians was a metropolis, much like LA, a lot of very, very international, very cosmopolitan. And there was a set of believers there that just trying to understand what this means. And so he's rehearsing some of the tradition and history. Now, Paul's writings were actually written before the Gospels. So we have some of the earliest understanding of the Christians and their thinking and theology at this time. So he's rehearsing it. So our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was appeared to Cephas, this is Peter, then to the 12. Hey, wait a minute, where's Mary?
Yeah, right.
What? Wait a minute. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. So he's really kind of lifting them up, of saying, you know, we have this evidence of people who've seen him, who were there, who mentioned him. But where's Mary in this picture? Right? Completely written out of the tradition, and the history, and the reality. Again, And, we've had problems with Paul
Yeah, right.
over the time, but it's just saying that part of it was, where is this aspect of it? And again, we kind of inherited this bias in women in the scriptures, and the role of women in the church. And I know we have one significant denomination that has a problem of raising women to the status of being pastors or priests, of that nature. But, we've only been at it for 2,000 years. So.
It'll take a little more time.
It'll take a little more time, right? A little more time. So we have this understanding of, unfortunately, who she is. We believe that she had a really significant role, but history and culture really has relegated her to kind of on the sidelines. So I just want to go on. I think I made the case there. Luke says in his gospel that the women's were, even he writes something like, when the women came to tell the disciples, hey, we saw him. And here's the words they use. They seemed to them like idle tale, idle gossip, and did not believe them. God, I could keep feeling it. And once again, like, come on. They were there. They go, how you women are. You're tickled. You're excited. It's an emotional time. Can we really get into this? Like, come on, calm down. It's all over. It's all over. But at least Peter says, I'll go check it out. And he does, and so he gets top billing. He comes back with the news. He is risen. Oh, all right. Peter says he's okay. We believe it.
So we
believe him. And it goes on to history, and Paul picks it up. Paul wasn't there, right? So, but he hears it. He goes, okay. The story I got, Peter was there. So we forget that part of it. But don't give up hope yet. Don't give up hope. There's still hope.
It only took 2,000 years.
So the Apocrypha, these are books that haven't been really vetted as really truly coming out of that. But there's a lot of tradition and idea that captures the kind of discussion of the day, how people thought about women, about Jesus and other things. And the Gospel of Peter, because they do attribute him that he wrote something, though maybe he didn't because he was a fisherman, probably wasn't as educated as Paul was, who was trained in the university and did those kind of things, or Luke, who was probably a medical doctor, or some of the other individuals. But they kind of he's the man, so we're going to attribute it to him. He does talk about almost kind of reluctantly that there was Mary, she was there. Can we get on with it? And then the Gospel of Thomas. Remember Thomas, the so-called doubting Thomas, and we talked about that. That's a bad name for him too. I don't know how come we always name these people and really put them in a really bad light. He also mentions Mary at the very end of the book, but he has this. Peter saying this. This is another. I just kind of like, come on. Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life. Whoa. Like, come on. This is our thing. We're here. He picked us. You're not there. And then he even goes to say this. Now, this sounds really sexist. But I want to just explain this a bit. And then Jesus says, according to this story, it's not in the Bible, but it's apocryphal. I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself a male will enter the kingdom of heaven. Wow. You have to become male to get into heaven. Right? Yeah. So now you understand where we are today.
Yeah.
Right.
It's infiltrated not only the culture, but even into our religion, institutions, and how we operate. Right? It seems reasonable to conclude from this little brief discussion that Mary was reluctantly accepted as a disciple and the witness. A culture that devalued the testimony of women in the face of the opponents who debunked the resurrection. The Christian tradition was somewhat uneasy about women being the first witness of the resurrection, and then therefore muted it. Yet, in spite of this provocative muting, John still kind of sneaks it in there, saying, come on, we just got to tell like it is. She did. She was. Right? Now, so we have this idea where women are and how tradition has helped them. But how did she come to be even labeled, even worse than just, like a groupie, but a prostitute? Where did that come from? Because we don't have anything. I haven't read anything that said that she was, that was her business. Or what she had to do.
That song said it.
That song said it? Way back, right. That song said it. Yeah, that song did it. That comes from that tradition there. So we have to go back outside the Bible and history, and I did a little thing on this, and you can look it up at Wikipedia and then follow this on there. But it goes back to the 4th century. So this is like, 300 BC or something like that. There was a Syrian deacon who was well respected with the Syrian Christian Church, Orthodox Church, who kind of hinted that she was a repentant sinner, right? That she, this aspect of had these demons in her, and where she was, healed from those. Well, those demons have morphed into sins in the history. They weren't just people struggling with their own issues, but these were sins that she was struggling with. And so she had all these sins. Boy, she was a really wicked woman, and she was therefore a repentant sinner because she was following Christ. So then we jump forward to 591, the Common Era, and we have one of the first popes called Pope Gregory I. And he said in a homily, which is a sermon, that that was her. She was this person, this woman of ill repute. But he also conflated that Mary with the Mary of Bethany, or the Mary, the sister of Nazareth. So he had these I don't think he was a good Bible study or history, because he put it all together and came up with this idea of this woman who happened to be also the one who washed the feet of Jesus.
Right.
We didn't have that name, but put it all together. Also the sister of Nazareth, and also this other person who was healed. And so we have this composite, just much like what writers do. They kind of put it all together, have this nice little character, having fun, stuff like that, right? So this is, these are writers, so they come up with stuff like that. So that history is not new, but it's there. And sometimes, unfortunately, because it comes from the hierarchical institution, then it becomes true. And so even our popular writers pick up on that and make a beautiful, an amazing song. Fortunately, the Roman Catholic Church has repealed that declaration in 1969. So it took almost 2,000 years for us to kind of clear it up, or another 1,900 years to kind of clear that up, that story there. And it wasn't like all the churches really agreed with that. Actually, the Eastern Orthodox churches truly always saw her as a disciple of Jesus. And they believed that after the resurrection, she became a companion of Mary, the Virgin Mary, and even became known as a saint. And so she is a saint. July 22nd is celebrated as the sainthood of Mary Magdalene. So there is a little bit of redemption here to do that. But the most important aspect of this, when she says, I have seen the Lord. Now, she didn't just act on it on her own. The few verses before that, let's go back to John. Let's go back to John 20. Let's go back to John 20. And we read 18, but let's read number 17. 115, page 115. So Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me because I have not yet ascended to the Father." Now, you heard me preach, those who were here heard me preach, that holding on was holding on to these aspirations and dreams of what she thought he was to be about. And he said, don't hang on to those. Don't hang on to the past. We're on another journey, and I want you to know that.
Michael,
Yes.
what part again? Page 115?
115, verse 17.
17, okay.
Yes, I have not. But go, he's telling her, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, my God, and your God. Now, I just want to focus, but go. For the evangelicals in the room, it's, we're supposed the Great Commission is to go and preach the gospel to all, all creation, really. That's what it really means, the world, cosmos, creation. So that means even redeem nature. Hello. So we don't always get that, but it's there. But it's the same word that they used with the apostles. Right? You go, you're not just a follower now, you are to deliver a message. So, since maybe as back as the 10th century, but certainly in the 12th century, Mary was already being called apostle to the apostles. Or the apostle of the apostles. You heard it here? I did not hear it first, but maybe it's been said before, but you're going to hear it another time. She was not just not only saw Jesus as the first person, right? Not only was she supporting him, right? She was the first apostle.
Yeah.
To go tell the good news to the very followers of Jesus. Kind of the irony of it all, right?
Yeah.
They had to be told he's
her.
risen, but he has something else going on, and I was tasked to tell you. That's the significance of it. I have seen him. I have seen the Lord. So at the end of the story, Mary comes into clear focus. She was definitely one of the women who was there in the background when Jesus was crucified. She had probably more guts than any of the males there. She was one of those who was there when they put him, what was left of his tattered body, into the tomb. Remember, they had a tradition of taking care of the body for 3 days. She was going to go there and take care of that, and then it was gone. And she was afraid that they stole the body and all that, but then she confronted the risen Lord. And by the time you see her at this time, it says she came in darkness. This is great. This is great writing here now. This is great drama. It's dark. So it's not just nighttime. There's this understanding that, when things aren't bad, it's dark in our lives. It is dark. It's ugly. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we feel that. And there she is in that aspect of it. And as I said, there was no big explosion or whatever, but she confronted this, and all of a sudden, by the word, she was enlightened. It lit up. What is all this about? So Jesus had much to do and far to go, he was more or less telling her. And so did she. And the first thing she did was to go back to the disciples to report, as I said, I have seen the Lord. And whatever dark doubts they may have had on that subject earlier, it was evident by the look on her face. I can just imagine the panning of the camera on her face. And something is different. Not just for her, but for all of humanity. And they all run, because they all want to get a piece of that. They all want to bathe in the light of that new knowledge and experience. In her darkness, she is ministered to, and her life goes in a different direction when Jesus calls her to go and tell the brothers about this. his first command was to tell a woman to preach to the disciples, and she became an apostle. We need to realize that our most